Hey, Will, yeah, thanks for joining me. I think it would be cool to, we've obviously been hearing a lot about AI. It's very topical, but you're one of those people that has been cutting through that noise, trying to figure out what's actionable, what isn't, and it'd be very helpful to get your perspectives on what's hype and what's real. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about your background.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. I'll kind of try to summarize in 30 seconds. I started my career as a founder, started a machine learning company in San Francisco in 2015. So kind of back before AI was cool. We built that company up over 4 years, raised a few rounds of venture. And then I had a stint at a Lyft, the ride sharing platform, led a couple product areas there, and had the opportunity to poach a bunch of researchers from the self-driving team and kind of bring a bunch of AI functionality across other parts of the business. So built out a lot around fraud prevention, security, automated a lot of work on workflows on the customer support side. And we made a lot of progress, but decided I didn't want to spend my life at a big tech company, wanted to do something a little bit more interesting. And actually took a left turn and ended up joining a firm called Ark Invest, which is Kathy Wood's firm. And Kathy has, I think, a pretty unique approach to hiring. So she prefers to hire people with domain expertise versus just a traditional finance background. So I had the opportunity to join the team, and I ended up leading our AI and software research and coverage. So it was covering a big portion of Ark's portfolio in the public markets, several $billion in equity exposure, and then had the opportunity to partner up with my current co-founder of my current firm, Max, and actually launch Ark into the private markets. So we brought Ark into the private markets, launched a venture fund, invested in a bunch of great companies. We were early in Anthropic, which is now one of the AI leaders, Mosaic ML, which Databricks acquired for $1 billion, and a handful of others, and did that for a while. And after a period of time, Max and I looked at each other and said, hey, maybe we should go build our own firm. And so we decided to spin out of Ark and launched a new firm called Autopilot in the beginning of 2024. And Autopilot is a firm predominantly focused on AI. We invest the early growth stage. So really kind of Series A to Series D is our sweet spot. And we've invested in 5 companies to date. XAI was our first investment. So Elon Musk's new AI company. Scale AI was the second investment. And then we've invested in a few others since then. So super high level, but that's my background. I've spent the last 10 years building in and around AI.
How was your transition from working in the industry to working in finance? And it does sound like Hadi has this interesting approach to bring people to domain expertise. How did you find that transition?
Yeah, I always joke. It's my colleagues were, had PhDs in biotech or biology, or they were rocket scientists and they were covering these really complex areas. I think you can teach a monkey to invest in software. It's not that complicated. But I think the big difference is when you're building a company, as you know, or when you're building products at a big tech company, you spend a lot of your time zoomed in, right? You're thinking about all the little tiny details that are going to matter. And when you're building product, you're thinking about where the button should go and all these little details. Investing is much more about zooming out and really trying to understand the big picture. And you have to zoom in occasionally when you're looking at a specific company or financials. But you spend a lot more of your time zoomed out and just thinking, really trying to understand what the world's going to look like 5 to 10 years from now and what companies are going to win in that world. And for me, I enjoy that side a lot more. I enjoy the sort of zooming out and thinking about the long term a lot more than spending every single day thinking about where a button should be. And so I think that was the biggest transition, but it was really kind of a crazy experience. I joined and I had worked informally with another venture capital firm for several years, so knew something about investing, but I was not a professional investor and sort of got handed a portfolio and said, all right, what do we do? And Kathy has been a great mentor, and Brett Witten, who was Ark's head of research, was a great mentor as well, and I learned a lot from them. But yeah, I think that's the big difference. It's kind of zooming in versus zooming out.
Before we get into what you think the world's going to look like 5 years from now, based on all this zooming out, I'm curious how you do it. What's your process? How do you go from today and extrapolate into the future?
It's a great question. I was just talking to someone the other day who is a very, very good venture investor that I respect. And we had probably an hour-long conversation about this. And I think for me, my research process is very unstructured. And I like to combine kind of three called sources of information. The first is history. History doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. And I think we can learn a lot about investing by studying history in prior super cycles. And I think we're entering a super cycle now that looks a lot like the Industrial Revolution. And so I've spent a lot of time, and I continue to spend a lot of time just studying history. The second piece of information is really, or category of information is really understanding the technology. And I think, as we look at a lot of these AI companies, a lot of them are very technical. Like we just invested in a company called Ire Labs that's building sort of optical interconnect technology. So it's a new networking approach for data centers, and it's very technical. And so I spent a lot of time reading academic papers and trying to intimately understand the technology. I think if you don't understand the technology, you don't intimately understand where it's going and what problems cannot be solved. And then the third is just talking to smart people. I've had the opportunity and the privilege of getting to know some exceptional founders and other investors, and I just try to absorb as much information as I can. And when I'm trying to debate a subject, I usually try to find the two smartest people on the subject that have conflicting opinions and listen to both sides, and then apply sort of my understanding of technology and my understanding of history to try to come up with a thesis of which one I think is directionally correct.
What are some of those debates right now between the smart people in AI? And maybe it's not even so much about the smart people. There's a big hype cycle around it as well. There are a lot of companies that are just buying the .ai domain name and slapping it on their company logo and saying they're doing it without actually doing much on the back end. How do you differentiate between that? Like, what are some of the things that people are actively debating that you think are very relevant here?
I think there are several debates ongoing at the moment. I think the most recent debate we've seen, and it's January 31st, is what DeepSeek means for the broader kind of AI ecosystem. And for people that aren't familiar with DeepSeek, a Chinese company recently trained an AI model that is almost as good as OpenAI's O1 model. And this Chinese company claimed that they were able to train this model for $6 million, which is orders of magnitude less than OpenAI spent training O1. And so the debate that's been raging this whole week is, what does this mean for the ecosystem? If you're able to train a model for a fraction of the cost using some novel techniques like pure reinforcement learning, we're going to need less compute, right? So what happens to NVIDIA and what happens to OpenAI's $500 billion Stargate project? And I think that this debate, in my opinion, is a little bit silly for two reasons. The first is that $6 million figure is not accurate. That's basically the fully optimized final training run. It's sort of like saying you won the Super Bowl after playing football for 60 minutes. Like, yes, that's objectively true, but you excluded all the time you spent practicing and playing games leading up to the Super Bowl. So the final training run doesn't really represent the overall training cost, which was likely, in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think the number is actually a little bit false. There was also distillation of OpenAI's models. They basically plagiarized a lot of the work that OpenAI and Meta had done on Llama. The second reason it doesn't matter is because of something called Jevons paradox, which essentially suggests that as costs decline, demand goes up. And this is true throughout the history of technology. I think the interesting parallel is if we go back to Moore's law and go back to say the 1980s with computers, people probably looked at Moore's law and said, "Wow, transistor capacity is doubling every 18 months. That means we'll just need way fewer chips, right?" And that's not what happened, obviously, right? We just continue to push the frontier of capability, and the demand for chips went up, not down. And if you look at the last 14 years in AI, the cost to train and run inference on these models has declined 70% per year for 14 years. That's a 20 million fold cost decline over a 14-year period. And during that period, like, demand for compute has gone way up, not down. And so I think it's kind of a silly argument, but that's one of the big debates that's been raging this week around AI.
How is that debate impacting what you're seeing on the valuations of some of these companies, or how is this potential risk, whether it's real or not, impacting your investing approach?
Yeah, I think so. At Autopilot, we only invest in the private markets. But if you look at the public markets, I think the sort of blue chip semiconductor names like NVIDIA took a major hit this week. Not investment advice, but my personal opinion is that was way overblown. And I talked to some hedge fund friends this week who I think have split opinions, but generally I think demand for compute is going to continue to go up. And so those semiconductors, in my opinion, are going to be very well positioned for the next 5 years. So you kind of see the immediate reaction in the public markets. The private markets obviously move a lot more slowly and typically lag the public markets by 6+ months. But it is interesting because right now there are rumors that OpenAI is raising new capital at a $300 billion valuation, right as this DeepSeek argument is raging. And so you kind of have a split in the investment ecosystem or in the venture ecosystem. Half the world thinks OpenAI at $300 billion is cheap compared to its upside potential. The other half think it's crazy and overvalued. And I think this DeepSeek news kind of puts a new twist on the argument. And so haven't really seen much change in terms of private market appetite for AI companies, but you did see that kind of quick reaction in the public markets.
So what do you think the next 5 to 10 years are going to look like, whether it's across not just the pure AI plays, but I know you guys are also involved in the adjacent areas. And so, yeah, I'm curious what you think the entire landscape is going to look like and who the winners and losers are going to be.
I think if we zoom out for a second and look at kind of where AI is today from a technology standpoint and try to extrapolate where we're going, we've gotten to a point where AI can do many knowledge work tasks as good as the average human. And you see this in examples like coding models, where the best AI coding agents are writing code at the level of a junior software engineer at Google. And those models are only going to get better over time. If you look at where those models were at 2 or 3 years ago, they were pretty much useless. Now they're very useful. In 2 to 3 years, they're going to be much better. And humans are currently paid $32 trillion a year to do knowledge work, to write software code, to review contracts, to design circuit boards. And we're getting to a point, and we will get to a point in the next 5 years, where AI can do most of those tasks better, cheaper, and faster than humans. And I think the consequences of that are going to be very, very significant. If you look at software engineering, which is, I think, a good leading indicator, a lot of the big tech companies have slowed or paused hiring of junior software developers because now they have these AI coding agents and they pay $500 a year for a coding agent versus $200,000 or $300,000 a year for a human. And they're able to pair their senior engineers with these coding agents and maintain or increase the output and productivity that they had, prior to the sort of paradigm shift of just hiring more junior software engineers. I think that's representative of what we're going to see broadly across the entire landscape of knowledge work. And so I think the world is going to look a lot different in 10 years when AI can do most of our jobs better, cheaper, and faster than us. And so I think that's both kind of scary and exciting. It's scary because there's this existential question of what happens to the human knowledge workers, but it's exciting from a technology standpoint because most industries, I think, are going to be redesigned with kind of an AI native approach. And we see this in nearly every domain. I'll give you 2 examples. There's a company called Quilter AI that's using AI to design circuit boards. And, a human would take a couple of weeks to design a complex circuit board, and they might try 10 different layouts. Quilter's AI models can design a circuit board in a couple of minutes and try millions of different layouts and end up designing one that's much better than humans. And that's kind of a niche within electrical engineering, but it's one of thousands of niches where we're seeing AI companies build. Another example that touches maybe more of a traditional industry is seafloor surveying. A lot of companies like offshore wind companies, oil and gas companies need to conduct surveys of the seafloor before they start projects. And traditionally, you had a $100 million ship that cost $100,000 a day to operate that would go and collect data with its sensor platform, and then a human would analyze that data and produce a report. Well, there are a couple of companies, one called Bedrock that we're investors in, that have realized, okay, we can take that sensor platform and take it from the size of an SUV to something more like the size of a football. And if we do that, we don't need this giant ship. We can basically create a much smaller vessel that we can operate autonomously to conduct these surveys. Instead of having that data go to a human who's analyzing it, we can plug that data into an AI model and have the AI model actually analyze the data, clean it, and generate the report. And so you're able to conduct these surveys 100 times faster and 80% cheaper than the incumbent competition. And those are 2 examples. And I kind of pick niche ones on purpose, but that's true across, again, like thousands of different niches in different industries. And so it's touching everything.
Talk to me about the LP side of the equation. And you guys are focusing on early stage companies. You just talked about how the incumbents, on one hand, benefit from having scale and money to do this. And then we talked about like DeepSeek, maybe doing it for an order of magnitude less, maybe not quite so cheaply. Where do you think the winners are going to be? Or is it going to be the large incumbents that are well capitalized? Or do you think that the smaller players can catch up, if not surpass them? Is it maybe a niche industry thing, or in certain smaller industries that don't get a lot of love from the big tech companies that you can, examples that you gave can succeed? What do you think that this fight between David and Goliath, how's it going to play out?
It's a great question. If we look at our investable universe, we break it down into 3 different categories. The first is infrastructure. And I think as the build out continues and demand for compute increases, there are a ton of opportunities at the infrastructure layer to sell picks and shovels to sort of enable this entire build out. I mentioned, we invested in this company, IR Labs, which is you basically building next generation networking technology for data centers that makes data centers 5 to 10 times more efficient. And there are many examples of that. So the infrastructure space to us is really exciting, and we're spending a lot of time there. The second category are the foundation models, companies like Anthropic, xAI, OpenAI. We've been very selective here. So my prior firm at ARC, we invested in Anthropic very early in their life cycle. They've done very well, and it's been great to see the team execute there. At Autopilot, we decided to invest in xAI, Elon Musk's new company. And our reasoning behind that, the reason why we think they're going to emerge as probably the winner in this ecosystem, or one of the major winners, is because they have more compute than anyone else, right? Elon built a 100,000 GPU cluster and stood that up in 19 days. It would typically take a company a year, 2 years to actually do that. And he did it in 19 days. So you have the Elon effect, and he's continuing to build out more compute than anyone else on Earth. And if you look at scaling walls, compute really matters. He also has a lot of data, proprietary data from Twitter, real-time data feed, and access to all of Tesla's data. And so as these models move from just text-based to trying to understand the real world and be applied to physical applications, that Tesla data set is incredibly valuable and unique. And third is distribution, right? To all of Twitter's users or X users, which are in the hundreds of millions. And so we decided to sort of take a bet here on XAI, and we think they're in a really interesting position. But it's very hard for new startups. And so I would typically avoid companies that are starting now and trying to compete with OpenAI, with XAI, with Anthropic, because you need a lot of compute and economies of scale are real here. So I think that the winners have sort of been picked in that layer. And I think,
Just interject there for a second, and I'd be curious to go maybe a little bit deeper on the modeling side of this, because and this was part of the argument that was made with DeepSeek, is that it takes a lot to run these initial training data sets. But once you run them, what you're left with is just like these like matrices of weights in part of the model. And that is the IP of the company. But if that IP were to get stolen, in a dramatic example, then you don't need to run all that training. You can just take the result, and the result is much smaller. Almost have like tons of data at the top end, but then it gets funneled down into like a small set of like vectors. Once you have that answer, then you can copy it and do something else with it. Obviously, that's industrial espionage and all sorts of issues there. But that aside, how do you is there validity in that? Do you think that it is easy to steal the homework once the homework's been done, and any other company can now benefit from it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if all you're doing is selling, model weights essentially, then yes, that's true. There is a risk of those weights being stolen, or as we've seen with DeepSeek, they ran something called distillation, which is basically like using the outputs of O1 to train their own model, and you can think of that as sort of plagiarizing a little bit. And so we see that for sure, and that's why I think these model companies have tried to become vertically integrated AI companies and push into their own kind of consumer or enterprise focused products. If you look at OpenAI, without ChatGPT, it's not really a compelling business. The entire business and the way that most investors are underwriting OpenAI at the current valuation is really on the ChatGPT franchise. And so it's really that distribution and the consumer products, and to some degree enterprise products, but really more consumer products that are driving the value. I think that's a problem to some degree, because over a long enough time horizon, you can kind of see a scenario where the operating systems like Apple end up really owning the sort of consumer AI use cases. And if that happens, right, then the sort of ChatGPT franchises of the world might be under some pricing pressure. And so I think that's kind of the long-term risk to the kind of consumer focused product model. I think with XAI in particular, they obviously have that with their distribution through X. And that's where the majority of revenue is coming from today. And so they have that consumer franchise, and they already have distribution to hundreds of millions of users. And so they definitely check that box. I think what's more interesting, though, is as these models become more agentic and move into reasoning and move into applications in the physical world, part of the challenge is actually running the infrastructure to enable high-speed inference on these models. And like that's why you see, I think to some degree, OpenAI building out Stargate. Yes, it's for training to some degree, but it's also because I think they're trying to intercept demand for usage of these models, and you need a lot of infrastructure and a lot of compute to serve these models and do it in a way that's performant. And so I think moving forward, I agree with you. Like just the pure weights of a model, if that's all you're doing is trying to sell model weights, like that's going to be a tough business model. And you have Meta and others who are committing massive amounts of capital to creating open source versions of these models. So I think the differentiation really comes down to your distribution and ability to productize your models and wrap them in something other than just an API. And then on the API business, your ability to reliably deliver sort of high speed inference. And I think that's why you see sort of this new emphasis on building out compute, not just for training, but also from an inference standpoint.
It's fascinating, and I think it's worth talking a little bit more about where in this supply chain most of the value is going to go to. And there's this Warren Buffett quote about him visiting a textile factory, and someone there saying, "Hey, I have great news. We discovered a process that's going to make us like twice as efficient to create these clothes." And Warren says, "Gee, I hope that's not true, because if it is, I'm going to have to sell the company." And what he meant by that is it's in industries that require big capital expenditures to innovate. It sounds great. You're investing in this new thing and it's going to produce all these results, but you lose track of where are those benefits where are they going to accrue to? Can you pass that on to the customer? And what happens in a lot of industries, prices fall down because the competitor also does the same thing. So now you're left with a massive capital expenditure bill. You have to build this new factory, and you can't maintain prices because everyone else is doing the same thing. And you mentioned part of that within the ChatGPT, like these interfaces where it's now everyone's coming up with one, prices are going to zero potentially, right? You see them just integrated into search engines. And yes, where do you think the value is going to get captured? Can there be consumer facing applications that can have a moat around them, or is it more in the picks and shovels side where you're providing infrastructure for a lot of companies to do their own thing. You don't care how they monetize, but you know they'll need to rely on your frameworks to do it.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunity in infrastructure, but on the application side, and this is kind of the third category of our universe, I think the mistake that a lot of investors are making is they're looking at moment in time growth rates and not thinking about the market 5-7 years from now. And you look at a lot of markets today, like AI sales assistants, really useful products. They're creating a lot of value for customers. These companies are growing very quickly because it's solving a real problem. But if you look at the competitive landscape in that market, you have hundreds of startups competing for the same dollar. And you have big incumbents like Salesforce who are pushing down market. And so in a market like that, where you have that level of competition, it's very hard for one company to develop meaningful pricing power. And it's really, in some sense, going to be a race to the bottom. You have to lower your prices to compete. Your customer acquisition cost goes up because you have to spend more on marketing to sort of rise above the noise. And so I think that's where a lot of investors are going to lose money, is investing in these markets that are just too crowded. And something we spend a lot of time thinking about and asking ourselves is 5, 7, 10 years from now, will this company be N of one? Like, will they be the monopolist in their market? And often that leads us into markets that are a little bit more complex, where you have incumbents that are structurally disadvantaged, where they're not technology companies. I mentioned the seafloor surveying market as an example, and I think it's a good one because the incumbent competition are, ship operators, right? They're not technology companies, and they're not going to go build their own autonomous underwater vehicles. It's just not their expertise. And there are 2 or 3 interesting startups in that market who are executing. And I think those 2 or 3 startups are just going to end up owning the market, right? They're going to bulldoze the competition, the incumbent competition. And that's where we tend to get a lot more excited, are in these markets where the incumbents are structurally disadvantaged. There were 2 or 3 really interesting startups that we think are ultimately going to win the market, and they have advantages that compound with scale. So the bigger that they get, the harder they are to compete with. That comes to some degree from data advantages. It comes to some degree from economies of scale, where the more units you produce, the lower your cost of production. In certain businesses, it comes from network effects. But I think that's really where we tend to focus, and that's where we believe a lot of the value is going to accrue. But it doesn't matter how much value you create for a customer. If you're in a commoditized market, you're not going to capture any of that value. And I think you're right in the sense that, like, a lot of these markets that seem obvious today are obvious to everyone. Therefore, there's a lot of competition, and it's unclear that any one company is going to break out and create a monopoly.
It's fascinating. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to learn more or chat?
Yeah, people are free to email me, will@apv.vc. They can also follow me on Twitter, WSummerlinAI, and feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, Will, I really appreciate you chatting with me today about this. It's going to be cool to check back in periodically and see how this is all playing out.
We'll have another podcast in 10 years and do a retro analysis on predictions.
That's the only thing we're going to be able to do, is just talk, because all our day jobs will have been automated by then. So
exactly. It's, if you're building or investing in it, it's great. And if you're not, you probably should pivot to building or investing in AI.
love it. Well, thanks so much, Will. It was good to see you.
Thanks, Mate.